Good evening and welcome to Wofford College. This is a wonderful evening to celebrate all that is best about a liberal arts educational experience. And here at Wofford, we grasp the tremendous responsibility we have to offer for students and members of our community to engage in significant issues in the world. For students, they discover their passions here and prepare lives for extraordinary and positive contributions to society. We provide these opportunities inside the classroom, and earlier today, for example, our speaker spent time with our student journalists talking about careers in journalism and writings on current and contemporary political affairs. Tonight's event is a perfect example of how Wofford makes thought-provoking, engaging experiences available to our students, our faculty, staff, and importantly, members of the Spartanburg community. David Brooks, our speaker this evening, became an columnist for the New York Times in September of 2003. He's also a commentator on PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He's also a faculty member at Yale University and looking forward to joining the faculty at Wofford College soon. There we go. I've made the offer right now. We're delighted. He's the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement, and his most recent book, The Road to Character, published in 2015. Mr. Brooks will talk and has generously agreed to do a Q&A afterwards. So please, let's give a warm Wofford College and Spartanburg welcome to David Brooks.
Thank you. So do health benefits come with that? What about those nice parking spaces near the football field? You only make that offer because you don't actually know how low the standards at Yale University are before they're... It is a great pleasure. This is my third visit back to Wofford. I came here in 2003 to give a talk, and then I came back here probably around 2005 trying to persuade my son to come here. And we did a campus visit here. And one of the things I've learned on campus visits, first, if you've done these college visits, no human being is as invisible as a parent on a college tour. You basically don't exist, and your kids do not want you to talk, breathe, move with them. And I tried with all three kids to influence them to one college or another, and they all rejected my advice. So don't blame me. I had a great time with the students today. No offense, it's always more fun for me to meet with the students in the afternoons than sometimes to give the talk to the adults. But I'll try to give some of the same messages I gave to them to you guys, though I'll speak slowly and use smaller words. They asked very good questions, a lot of questions on political moderation, which was interesting to me, and a lot of questions on writing. And of course, it brought me back to my own college days. I was not necessarily a good student. I often tell the story of how I came to political consciousness. I grew up in New York City, and my parents were sort of hippies in Greenwich Village in the 1960s, and I often tell the story of they took me in 1965 to a be-in, which is where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they listened to a lot of folk music, and then they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. So I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was sort of my first step over to the right. And then and now my joke is I'm a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is like being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. Then I went to high school. I don't like to brag about my high school career, but I did graduate in the top 85% of my class. And I knew I wanted to become a writer. The students and I were talking about writing and how to write. And I told them the true story, which was when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And writing, I've done it every day pretty much in 49 years since that moment. I remember in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I was thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But so we had different values. And then after my stellar high school career, the admissions officers at Columbia, Brown, and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which was the one school I got into. The saying about Chicago is it's the school where fun goes to die, is the cliche. But my favorite saying about it is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas, which is a good. And it was an intellectually intense place. I majored in philosophy and celibacy, those two. And then, actually, this is true. I was a student school paper, and believe it or not, I was a humor columnist. And I wrote on my senior year. William F. Buckley, the great columnist, came to campus, and I wrote a humor parody of his life for being a name-dropping blowhard. And so I can't remember all the jokes, but it was something like Buckley wrote the first 3 volumes of his memoirs on the day of his birth, all of human history up to his conception, then Seeds of Utopia about his gestation, The Glorious Dawn about his birth. He founded 2 magazines, one called The National Buckley and one called The Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And so he must have liked it. And at the end of his speech, he said, "David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job." And that was my first break. That was the big break in my life. I actually wasn't in the audience. I was, this is literally true. I'm not name dropping, though it is kind of offensive. I was debating Milton Friedman on my first TV appearance in my life. He had a show where he had debated people, college students, and he was the greatest debater in human history. And I had just spent like 3 minutes reading an economics textbook. And so the show, you can find it on YouTube, is me making an argument that I just read somewhere, him destroying the argument in about 6 seconds, and then about 30 seconds of the camera lingering on my face as I try to think of what to say. That was the show. But my school really did form me. I don't know about you guys, but the mentors and the schools I went to, I feel more influenced by them now than I did on the day I graduated. And one of the things Chicago did was it taught me what to want. Like, it made me fall in love with books and told me what was worth wanting. I think that's we think about, what do you get out of school? You learn some skills, but you learn what's higher and more important than the other things. And I think especially a liberal arts college like Wofford, that's really what you're learning. And you're coming in contact with your teachers. You may not remember what they say, but you remember who they are and what they valued. And if you have the intimate contact with the faculty as you do here, that's what really leaves a mark. And I'm really struck by how some schools leave a mark on students and some don't. And the schools that leave a mark are the ones that are unafraid to be different. They're unafraid to be distinct. And they have their own ethos. And that's what's so great about coming here. And now I do teach now at Yale. I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. That's my rule. I'm pretty sure you're safe here. I could not have gotten in here. And my students are amazing. They have the ability to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. I ask them, like, what are you doing at spring break? And it's always like something outrageous. I'm going to unicycle across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're doing these amazing community service. They have phenomenal abilities to suck up to their teachers. They have to write an essay to get into my class. And they'll write, the essay you wrote, so-and-so, had such a big influence on my life. And I feel like saying you were 3 weeks old when I wrote that essay. It's exciting to be around them. And so what I wanted to talk to you tonight about was a bit about the world they're going to enter. And I hope in talks, so much of what we do on the news is react to the day's events. And I wanted to talk about 3 different historical eras one of which some of us were born into, one of which some of us grew up in, and which I think is ending, and then what's to come. And I'm going to talk about the first era, which is the post-war era, the era from 1950 to 1968, say, or say 1945. And I'm going to talk about different cultures. We had different American cultures. I'm going to start with this culture, the post-war era. It occurred to me how different it was from today when I was driving home. This was several years ago, and I was listening to NPR in my town in Washington, and they rebroadcast old radio shows. And this particular night, I happened to turn on NPR, and I heard a show called Command Performance. It was a show that went out to the troops in World War II. And the episode I happened to hear was the episode that broadcast on VJ Day, the day the Allies learned they'd beat Japan. And it was just 2 hours after they'd learned this. And the host of the show gets out there and says, it's Bing Crosby. He says, we've just learned we've won the war, but I guess we don't feel too proud at this moment. We're just humbled and we're glad we got through it. And I was really struck by the tone of humility. Then it was repeated through the show. They had an actor, if some of you may remember, Burgess Meredith. And he got out and read a passage from Ernie Pyle, the great war correspondent. And Pyle wrote, we won this war because we have a lot of great allies, we have brave soldiers, we have a lot of material wealth in this land. We didn't win it because we're better than anybody else. We just should stay humble and be worthy of the peace. And I was really struck by this tone. And I went in and I turned on the TV just with this in my mind, and I turned on a football game, not the Panthers, another team. I watched a quarterback throw a pass to a wide receiver who was tackled after a 2-yard gain. And he did what all professional athletes do, the defensive player, after moments of great achievement, he did a victory dance in honor of himself. And it occurred to me I'd seen a bigger self-puffing victory dance after a 2-yard gain than I'd heard after winning World War II. And that symbolized to me a culture, a shift in the culture from self-effacement, I'm no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than me, to a culture of achievement. Look at me, look what I did. And there was a tone of modesty in that culture. I covered the campaign of George H.W. Bush, and he, because he was raised in that culture, remember he was the youngest pilot in World War II in the U.S. forces, he was raised to never talk about himself. He was running for president, and the campaign staff wanted him to talk about himself. You got to say why you're going to be a great president. They would write it in the speeches, and he would chop out any first-person pronoun out of the speeches. And finally, they said, you're running for president, you got to talk about yourself. So he put in a speech with a paragraph about how great he was, what a good president he would be. And his mom, who was still living, called him up and said, George, you're talking about yourself. And he chopped it out. And so that was an ethos of modesty. And along with that ethos went a theory of spiritual formation. How do you make yourself into a good person? And the ethos was you pick out the weakest part of yourself and you combat it. That the inner drama against your own sin is the most important part of your life. And if you don't do that well, your sin will swallow you up. And in my last book, I told the story of Dwight Eisenhower when he was 8. He wanted to go trick-or-treating. His mom wouldn't let him. And he threw a temper tantrum and punched the tree in his front yard so bad that it rubbed off all the skin off his fingers. And his mom, who was this remarkable woman named Ida, sent him up to his room, had him cry for an hour, came up and bound his wounds and recited a verse from Proverbs. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh the city. And he said, 60 years later when he wrote his memoirs, that was the most important conversation of his life because it taught him he had a problem, which was his anger and his temper. And he was going to have to beat that. And he really spent the rest of his life beating that. And so that was part of the ethos of that time. The second part of the ethos was an ethos of self-surrender. One of my heroes in the book is a woman named Dorothy Day. And Dorothy Day was a young woman who was sort of emotionally fragile. And when she read novels, she didn't just read the novels, she became like the characters she was reading about. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she's drinking a lot, carousing a lot, and 2 suicide attempts, 2 abortions. Her life is actually a wreck. But she gave birth out of wedlock to a daughter, and that changed her life. She wrote a little essay about what it's like to give birth, and in the end of the essay, a lot of it is about the pain of childbirth, But a lot of the essay, at the end, she writes something like, if I had painted the greatest painting, composed the greatest symphony, or sculpted the greatest sculpture, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. And with such a vast flood of love and joy came the need to worship. I needed somebody to thank for this joy. And at that moment, she became a Christian and spent the next 6 years of her life serving the poor, not only serving the poor, but living with the poor. And that was an act of self-surrender. And she became one of the great figures of the 20th century. And then finally, people in those days were committed to big institutions. And the character in my book, one of my heroes, is George Marshall, who some of you may know, who was committed his life to service to the U.S. Army. And he said, I will never put my own personal interest above the interest of the Army. And my favorite Marshall story comes in 1943, when he wanted to run the D-Day invasion. FDR calls him into the Oval Office and said, would you like to run the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord? And instead of just saying yes, Marshall said, you do what's best for you. My personal ambition has nothing to do with this. And FDR asked him 4 times. 4 times Marshall said no. And FDR took the chance to give the job to Eisenhower so he could keep Marshall close by in the White House. And that's just the kind of person he was. And so there were commitments to big institutions, big unions, big government, big companies like GM. If you ask people in those days, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? 80% of Americans said yes, 80%. Now 19% say yes. So there's just a lot more trust in institutions and trust in neighbors. So that was in some ways a very admirable culture, but it did have some sins. And I understand why people left it behind. One of the sins was emotional coldness, especially fathers to their children. Another sin was stultification. It got boring. If you go back and none of us would want to go back to the 1950s, in part because the food was so much worse than ours is today. More seriously, a tolerance for racism, tolerance for sexism, an overbelief in data and rationalization which led them to go into Vietnam against all evidence. And so that era came to the close, and came to the close in 1968. And I had given a talk earlier, Mr. Richardson was there, and I talked about the climax of the 1969 Super Bowl, Super Bowl III, where on one sideline you had, one quarterback was Joe Namath, and the other was Johnny Unitas. They were both boys from Western Pennsylvania, and Johnny Unitas was from one culture, crew cut, high tops, very boring, just do your job. While he played in the NFL, he had a job in a container factory making $150 a week. Like, don't draw too much attention, just do your job like you're a plumber doing your job. Joe Namath from a very different culture. He's from the 60s. He's a swinger. He did an ad where he was posting stockings, $5,000 fur coats. He was the star of these one essay called Namath All Night about the big party boy he was. He wrote a memoir which was titled, I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. Johnny Unitas would not have written a memoir with that title. And so that was a shift in culture to what we now know as sort of a more meritocratic system. Made greater emphasis put on brains and cognitive skills, much more diversity. In 1950, the average SAT score for the Harvard student was 590. By 1960, it was 690. If your father went to Harvard in 1950, your odds of getting in were 90%. But suddenly Harvard changed and the whole higher education changed. It became much more competitive, and we had a new social class, an educated elite. And I wrote a book about these educated elite. It's the sort of people who shop in progressive grocery stores like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, where all the cashiers look like they're on hire from Amnesty International. They all come in. I always say my favorite section of these progressive grocery stores is the snack food section, because they couldn't have pretzels and potato chips, that would be vulgar, so they have these seaweed-based snacks. Or we used to get this thing called veggie booty with kale, which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colorectal cancer, and they give them a snack. And so you get this combination of like high social consciousness, Whole Foods, or, but combined with relentless ambition, especially for their kids. And so I used, in my town where I used to live in Maryland, I'd watch the moms drive up to the elementary schools picking up their third graders, and the kids would have these 80-pound backpacks on their backs. If the wind blows them over, they're like beetles sort of stuck there on the ground. And I used to notice that the cars that would pull up, especially in sort of northeastern progressive suburbs, were like Audis, Volvos, Saabs, because it was okay to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That was fine. And these characters, I call them Uber moms, highly successful career women who took time off to make sure all their kids got into Harvard or Stanford. And you could tell the Uber moms because they actually weighed less than their own children. Like they were doing little butt exercises at conception, and when the kids come out, the Uber moms are cutting the umbilical cords themselves and flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the things, getting them ready for the... And so that was a new culture. And Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were part of that culture. And frankly, a lot of us on the right and the left, we went to certain schools. We lived in an economy where people who were good with words were rewarded with money, or people good with math who were rewarded with money. And that created sort of the educated class. And there are some virtues to that class. I think a lot more tolerance for diversity, a lot of creativity. Silicon Valley explodes with creativity. A lot of individual freedom and a great emphasis on freedom. But there were a lot of sins in that culture too. A chief rise in narcissism. They give these things called the narcissism test, where they ask people a bunch of statements and they say, does this apply to you? And their statements are things like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Somebody should write a biography of me. I love to look at my body. And in the last 20 years, the median narcissism score has gone up 20%. We're number one in the world when they give this test. An increased rise in fame. It used to be, if you ask college freshmen, what do you want out of life? It used to be the number one answer was, I want to have a meaningful philosophy of life. Now that's kind of up there, but financial security is number one, and being famous is number two. And they asked a group of junior high school girls, would you rather be president of Harvard or the celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant? And by 3-1, of course, they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant than president of Harvard. Although, to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. But so I think there was a rise in ego. There was an atomization and fragmentation. The last 30 years have been a very individualistic period in American history. Economic individualism, social indicism. You go to the commencement addresses, I hope not here, but a lot of places, you listen to all the advice. It's all about you. You do you. Follow your passions. Be true of your own drummer. This is completely garbage advice because most students don't know who they are yet. So telling them you do you does not help them. But it's led to a society that is much more fragmented than it used to be. Families are in decline. In 1970, 11% of kids were born to a single mom. Now 40% are. The majority of Americans trusted their neighbors, trusted the people around them. Now 32% say they trust their neighbors, and among millennials, only 19% say they do. It used to be only 8% of Americans lived alone. Now it's 28% who live alone, and in a lot of cities it's 40 and 50% living alone. There's been a decline in marriage, a decline in people having children. There are now more American households with dogs than with children. There's been a decline in friendship. The number of people who say they have no close friends in this generation. Loneliness. Americans over 35% suffer from chronic illness. This group is non-affiliated. The fastest growing political party is non-affiliated. There's been an epic rise of suicide, which is closely correlated with isolation. And there's been a monumental rise in opiate addiction, which is just a slow motion form of suicide. So the society has become much more fragmented. And the divisions have come along class lines. It used to be in 1965 the graduates, the families of high school educated parents and college educated parents were basically the same sorts of statistics. Now the divorce rates are like 3 times as high for high school educated than college. Voting patterns, they vote a third high school educated. High school educated are 3 times more likely to be obese. 10% of kids with college-educated parents grow up outside of marriage, only 10%. Among high school educated, 70% of those kids grow up outside of marriage. It's just a bifurcation. And so we have become a much more lonely crisis. And as I said, that's led to opiate addiction. It's led to a lot of things that drove Donald Trump's campaign. Feeling isolated, feeling betrayed, feeling a loss of dignity. I spent most of 2015 writing a series of columns, all with the theme, "Don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination." And having been so massively wrong, I figured I should spend the next year going around the country with Trump voters figuring it out, or at least trying to understand. And I heard so many stories of betrayal, so many stories of guys especially who had their best job at 35, and then all subsequent jobs were worse. And what I heard a lot of it was moral injury. There used to be a code you could say, hey, I'm not the richest guy on earth, I'm not the most famous, but my neighbors can count on me. And so I got some dignity there. And I don't know if it was reality TV or the celebrity culture, but now if you're not rich and famous, a lot of people feel invisible. I also found a lot of people who felt the thing they could really feel pride in was that they were American. And there was an American story that we all followed. And it was sort of like an Exodus story. We came out of oppression, we crossed the Atlantic, we founded a new Eden here. And this was the achievement of generations and centuries, and we were the lucky inheritors of it, and we could carry it forward. And a lot of people felt that that narrative, which gave meaning to their lives, was being ripped away from them. You didn't have that narrative anymore. You had a bunch of different narratives which didn't have much to do with America. There was an economic narrative that we're all part of a global economy. There was a Silicon Valley tech narrative that we're all we've got the exciting possibilities of borderless technology that can have these great disruptive influences. There was a multicultural narrative that we're not really Americans, we're a member of this or that subgroup, and whichever subgroup is most victimized is most prestigious. And a lot of people felt their sense of being American was being ripped away from them, which is a lot of what was the controversy over this weekend on the football fields. And so you get this sense that they had lost a sense of national cohesion. And then that was especially among the working class. Among the educated class, among my students, what I found was the culture of World War II gave their students a sense of a moral system that gave them a sense of dignity and what their purpose was for, what to sacrifice for. I find among many of my students and among many people in their 20s, they go through what I call a Telos crisis. They don't know what their purpose is. They have all these great skills, but nobody has helped them think through, why on earth was I put here? What's my calling? And Nietzsche has a phrase, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you know why you're here, then you can survive a setback because you basically know where you're headed in life. And a lot of students have no concept of that because, frankly, we in the adult world decided it was not our business to tell them what life was all about. It was up to them to figure out by themselves. And that's putting an unrealistic burden on a 22-year-old. And so they have tough 20-year-olds. And their periods in their 20s are tough. Some, you get these crack-ups. Some become what a writer named Matthias Dahlgaard called the insecure overachiever. I'll read you. Such a person, he wrote, must have no stable or solid foundation to build upon, and yet nonetheless tries to build his way out of his problem. It's an impossible situation. You can't compensate for having a foundation made of quicksand by building a new story on top. But this person takes no notice and hopes that the problem down in the foundation won't be found out if only the construction work keeps on going. And you find a lot of people in careers, they just have to keep going up and up and up because they don't actually know why they're here. And I think eventually it catches up to them. And as I said, we've become very rich in technology. A lot of us have become affluent in money, but the society overall has become poor in meaning. David Foster Wallace, the great novelist who committed suicide, noticed this in a lot of his friends. He wrote that there's something that doesn't have much to do with physical circumstances or the economy or any of that stuff that gets talked about in the news. It's more like a stomach-level sadness. I see it in myself and my friends in different ways. It manifests itself in a kind of lostness. This generation has an inheritance of absolutely nothing as far as meaningful moral values. It's not that they're bad, or it's not that we are bad as a society, we're just morally inarticulate. In my view, our public conversation, my business is, we're over-politicized and under-moralized. We talk about every poll and everything the president does, but the things that really matter in life is how do you build a relationship? How do you take a moment of suffering and turn it into a moment of spiritual growth? How do you practice grace? How do you practice love? How do you practice forgiveness? These are the relational things that we don't talk about as much as earlier generations. There used to be public theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Sheen, and they were out in the public sphere talking about moral issues in public. Now we sort of wall that off, and that's the most important thing. And so my last book was based on the concept that a lot of people have a clearer notion of how to build a good career than how to build a good character these days, and it has an effect. And that's because the master narrative for this era I'm talking about is the narrative of liberation. Break free from conformity. Break free from the big institutions. Do you. And when you have a narrative that's all about breaking free, it's really hard to know how to attach to things, how to commit to things. And so to me, what Donald Trump did, and I wrote this in my column today, and I've been thinking about it, if you remember, I talked about that first era, the 1950s. That was destroyed in the 1960s, and maybe rightly, maybe it had to go, it was right for its time, but its time had passed, by pranksters. If you remember the hippies, the people my parents were hanging out with, there was a guy named Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, the people who went to Woodstock. They created a series of outrageous statements that they were offended at the old establishment. And they set off a culture war, and there was all the conflict you remember in the 60s, and they didn't really build anything, but they tore down the old system. And to me, what Donald Trump does, he represents people, they're not quite sure what they're for, but they want to tear down a system that's not working for them. An economic system that's not working for them, a national identity that seems to take away their dignity, a political correctness that they feel doesn't allow them to speak their mind. And they like Trump because he's at least taken down the system. And every day and every week, and I don't particularly, it's not my cup of tea, he takes some wound in America and he jams a poker into it and everyone goes crazy. And it has the effect of Drake taking down the system. And as I say, I'm not a big Trump people. I'm sure there are people in the room who are. But I do think what he does is he marks the end of an era, an end of that baby boomer emphasis on individualism and emancipation. There's a great book by a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who was taught here, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the idea is there's a paradigm, and the paradigm might be Newtonian physics or whatever. In any field, there's a paradigm that everybody uses to understand. And then it gets, over time, it gets a little less solid. Evidence begins to contradict it. It gets a little more fragile. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes along and touches it, and it collapses. And then you get a period of competing paradigms, and then a new paradigm happens. I think Donald Trump basically took the Republican Party and maybe the culture of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and he touched it. And it's all coming down. And so we went through the authority culture of the 50s. We went through the freedom culture of the 1960s to today. And so I've been thinking about what's next. And I'll say when I took this tour of middle America to understand Trump voters, I saw a lot of bad stuff, but I saw a lot of really hopeful stuff too. I saw community healers at every spot. I was out in New Mexico on a Navajo reservation, and a couple came down from Minnesota, and they were doing drug treatment for 60-year-old Navajo ex-cons. That's not glamorous work. And the day I visited them, they had $17 in their bank account. There was a young woman, she'd come down from New England to a little neighborhood, a Latino neighborhood in Houston, between 3 freeways, and they had no after-school program, so she started one. And she was just, I saw her on the ground with all these kids, giving them some structure to spend their afternoons. remember she was teaching them this tongue twister. She wanted them to say this phrase 3 times. See if I can say it even once. Unique New York, unique New York. So it was charming. I have some friends who I was telling the students about earlier today who they have a kid in the DC public schools who had a friend who didn't have a home really. His mom was sick and on drugs, dad was gone, he had no food, he had no bed, so they took the kid in. And then that friend had a friend in a similar circumstance, and that friend had a friend. And now when you go to their home, there's like 15 mattresses on the floor, this is the basement. And if you go to their home, as I go once a week for dinner, I've done it for 3 years, there's 30 kids there, 18 to 20. And it's just the warmest family atmosphere. One young woman came new to us, and we have dinner around a table, and we eat chicken, the same chicken every week. And she said, this is the first time I've been to a family dinner table since I was 11. And I walked in there, and I went to shake a kid's hand who was, I was just meeting my first day, and he said, we don't shake hands here, we hug here. And so I'm like not the most huggy guy, but I learned to hug there. They have a total intolerance for social distance. And I have a friend named Bill Milliken who's probably like 80, and he's been doing youth work all his life, and I brought him to this. And he said, that's the warmest place I've been. And he said, I'm often asked, what programs can turn around a child's life? And he said, I've never seen a program turn around a kid's life. Only a relationship can turn around a kid's life. And so that's what I'm seeing among the healers. And what I see in them is I think we're not going back to the authority era of the 1940s. And we're not going back to the individualism and freedom area of the 1980s. But I think we can go back to, or go forward to a commitment era, where people use their individual lives, and there's great emphasis on what commitments you make in life. And I told the students today that they're all like 22, 21, that over the next 10 or 15 years, they're going to make 4 big commitments in their lives. And the fulfillment of their lives will depend on how well they choose and execute on these commitments. And their commitments to a faith or philosophy or community. And most of us have to make these big decisions, and then we have to live up to them. And so when you think in those terms, in terms of commitment, what is a commitment? Well, it's making a promise to something. It's making a promise to something without expecting a return. You might make a promise to your spouse, sort of hoping it'll be a good marriage and you'll be good in it. That's not why you make the promise. You make the promise because you love him or her. It's a realistic promise that you're going to carry out. And so to me, the best definition of a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. There's always going to be bad moments. But if you're committed to your job, to your team, to your spouse, you've got structure to keep you in there. It's love under law. It's the kind of commitment that in the Bible that Ruth made to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. I think if we put the emphasis on commitments, the first thing you see is that's where you get your identity. If you're not bound by your promises, you just float around. But when we meet each other, we learn very quickly what each other's commitments are, the way we reach out to things. The second thing is commitments are key to our integrity. A commitment is a promise over time. I'm going to be faithful to me. You can count on me. And every time you keep a promise, character is like a spokes of a wagon wheel. You make the spoke stronger. And every time you break a promise, you take out a spoke, and the whole thing's likely to collapse. Commitments also give you a sense of purpose. I think very few of us have a sense of purpose or a sense of identity or a sense of character alone. It's in relation to others. I saw a study done in 2007, Gallup organization asked people all around the world, do you have a sense of meaning in your life? And every country in the world. And the country where the most people said, yeah, I have a sense of purpose and meaning in my life, the #1 country was Liberia. Now, it wasn't because life was sweet in Liberia. It was war-torn in those days. It was because to survive, they had to make strong commitments to each other, and that gave them a sense of purpose. The country with the least sense of meaning and purpose was the Netherlands, pretty prosperous country. and basically was inversion of the income scale. And so what you see are all these people giving a sense of commitment and creating communities, and out of that, I think we can spread a new social fabric that will repair. I have a friend named Rod who lives up in northern Louisiana in a small town, and he had a sister named Ruthie. And Ruthie was a teacher, and I don't know if you've ever met these people, but there are some people I meet about once a month who just radiate an inner light. They just glow with joy. And she was one of those people, and she taught school, and unfortunately she died at about age 42. And the town only had 800 people, but about 1,600 people showed up at her funeral because she was that sort of person. And she loved to go barefoot. Her husband was a firefighter, and he carried the coffin with the other firefighters barefoot to her grave. But Rod tells this story that she died just before Christmas Eve, and one of the things Ruthie did for her town was she wanted the dead to be remembered on Christmas Eve. So she'd go to the town cemetery, and she'd put a candle before each grave, just on top of each grave. And she died just before Christmas Eve, and Rod said to his mom, you know, it's Christmas Eve, do you want to do what Ruthie used to do and put a candle on the gravestones? And his mom said, you know, most of the time I'd love to do that. Any other year I'd love to do that. But she's just passed, it would just be too emotionally hard for me to do that right now. Rod said fine, and they didn't do it, but then they drove across town to another family member's house, and they happened to drive by the cemetery, and somebody else had gone to the cemetery and put a candle on every gravestone. And that's how infectious commitments and community can be. And to me, out of that, you can rebuild a culture. And to me, you have to do it with these organizations, all the volunteer work, but more important, and this is really part of the work of universities, a change in consciousness, a change in mentality. To me, we have to become more communal in an age that's too individualistic. We have to use a moral lens in a culture that's too utilitarian. We have to give our students moral vocabulary and a moral language. And we have to be more emotional in an age that's too cognitive. And this really takes a revolution in the way we think. A lot of the culture today tells you, celebrate your independence. But in an age of commitment, you have to say, no, I'm going to celebrate my dependence. That the best moments is when I'm dependent on something. The world says, celebrate your autonomy. But you have to say, no, I'm going to celebrate my relation. The world says, speak in an active voice, be active, never in a passive voice. But you can speak in what they call the middle voice, which is the voice of living, listening, and then conversing. The world says, give ultimate earthly allegiance to diversity, tolerance, and openness. But you can say, no, I'm going to give ultimate earthly allegiance to goodness and warmth and truth. And the world says, there's no proper end to life. Everybody gets to practice the kind of goodness they want. But I think in this mindset, you have to say, no, I do know what the end of life and happiness and joy is found on the other side of selfless giving, not on this side. And so, as I said, I'm not the most emotionally feely guy. My friends say me talking about emotion is like Gandhi talking about gluttony. It's not my normal thing. But when you talk about emotion, or you talk about commitments, you're really talking about emotion first. You're seeing people not as brains on a stick, the way our schools often see students. You're seeing people ultimately as loving, desiring creatures, that the heart is more important than the head. And I do think that's true of us. I think we're more defined by what we desire than what we think. And when you merge into somebody, you don't merge into another person, you don't merge into a career, you don't merge into a faith because you think your way into it. You love your way into it. There's a great passage from Louis de Bernier, who was a novelist who wrote a novel called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. And in it, there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship to his wife. And he says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. And that's the kind of connection we want. And I think the upshot of that is what Ruthie had, that kind of joy. I've been thinking that, when one of the problems we have in society is what do we aim for? A lot of us aim for success. I'm not against success. A lot of us aim for status. But I ran across a book where the author said there are 4 levels of happiness. There's material pleasure, having a nice food, nice car, it's good. Then there's ego and comparative pleasure, the pleasure you get from winning some success, getting some recognition, you get a trophy, that's good pleasure. But the 3rd level is generativity, the pleasure you get from giving back to your community. And the 4th pleasure is moral joy. And that's the highest form of pleasure. And I've been thinking about what is moral joy. And one of it is when you're deeply connected in relation to other people. One of my professors at Chicago was a guy named Leonard Auditorium, who was a soldier in World War II. And he felt great joy when he was marching with his unit in the war. He said, words are inadequate to describe the emotion aroused by the prolonged movement of unison that drilling involved. A sense of pervasive well-being is what I recall. More specifically, a strange sense of perverse enlargement, a swelling out, becoming bigger than life, thanks to participation in a collective ritual. Sometimes when we're dancing with others or moving with others, we get that sense of connection to them. It gets even better, I think, when you're moving with others in pursuit of some moral ideal. Rabbi Wolf Kellman marched in Selma with Dr. King, and he described that experience. We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most joyous spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond words. Meaning was feeling strong, the moment of being overwhelmingly spiritual fulfillment. And so when people describe those moments of joy, you get a sense of like it's a meeting place where the boundaries between yourself and other people sort of disappear, and altruism becomes the same as selfishness, because in giving to others, you're sort of giving to yourself. And I think that's ultimately what we're shooting for. And so what I've tried to describe tonight was a culture in the 50s that had some good points and some bad points, but had to go because times changed. And we did another culture that had some good points and bad points that had to go. And I hope what we and what the students in particular are going to do over the next 30 years is create another culture that's not as deferential as the first culture, not as selfish and individual as the second culture, but is about relation and commitment and rediscovering some of the ancient truths that really our fathers and our faith fathers handed down to us. Thank you. Now we have time for questions. I think there are 2 microphones there, and I think Annie's bringing a microphone up there. And so now we can talk about the Republican health care plan, or whatever. We'll start right here in the middle.
Hi. So I'm a big believer in relationships like you are. Do you see any way that the online growth or the growth of online communities can help with that, or is it too impersonal to allow for those relationships to form?
Yeah. So I'm not a big technophobe. I don't think technology is necessarily ruining us. They've done studies, does Facebook make us lonelier? And the evidence seems to be that it doesn't make us happier or lonelier. If you have a lot of friends in life, you can use Facebook to augment your friendships. If you're lonely, you use Facebook to hide your loneliness. But it's what you bring to Facebook, not Facebook itself. But I do think the evidence, there are 2 things. The one thing that is being destroyed is our attention span. And that's certainly true for me. I'm reading a book. As you can tell, I read a lot of books, but every 3 pages I'm checking my phone. If you want to drive, they've done this study, how do you drive mice insane? Irregularly timed rewards. And that's what my phone is for me. I always think the next email is going to be a good one. Never is, but I think that. And so I think it's hurting our attention span. And the second thing we know is that the only relationships that really make a mark on people's lives are face-to-face, that the emotions just aren't the same. That's because when they do analyses of face-to-face relationships, when we're in conversation with each other, the flow of our words is the same speed. We adapt to each other. Our breathing, we breathe at the same level. We begin to smell the same as each other. We're mammals, and we really harmonize with each other, and that's where relationship is built on subtle harmony. And the second thing that we learn is we can only really learn and think well face-to-face. There was one study done at the University of Michigan where they took some math problems, and they had two different kinds of groups solve it. Those who were communicating online by email and those who were face-to-face. The email groups could not solve the problem. The face-to-face groups solved the problem easily. And the groups that solved them most easily were the groups where people took the most turns talking. They quickly listened and they volleyed back and forth. And so the face-to-face has got to still be here. And I'm struck by the fact that online technology is going like this, but the conference business is also going like this. People need to be face-to-face. There's one upstairs, right here.
I just want to say thank you on behalf of the student body. I appreciate you coming here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being gracious at Wofford. Usually speakers are shouted down these days. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, again, I'm not such a big believer in generations having life stages. Like a lot of us face the same sorts of crises. Millennials have some things that it's different. The social media, I would not have liked to have gone to high school in the age of social media, when if you don't get invited to the party, you know about it. I was happy not knowing about the parties I wasn't getting. And I do think, as I said, we as adults have given you very little in terms of moral guidance. We've said you're on your own. Discover it yourself. And that's just a horrible burden to put on young people. It's also, life is just much more competitive than it was. When I look at my students, not only was I not as impressive as most of them are, I didn't know anybody who was as impressive. But the thing I find, and I'm not going to look into your soul because the lights are in my face, but I can do that. I find a high level of fear. Sometimes a fear that if I screw up once on the ladder to success, it's all over. And that there's a fear of missing out, the fear of committing because you're afraid there'll be something else. And then partly because of social media, everybody's measuring each other by the other people's highlight reel, not real life. And so they're measuring it by who happens to be on top at that moment of their life. And I've already said this a couple times today, but one of the great questions to ask yourself is, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? And because fear is a very good GPS system of what you really want, even if what you really want is on the far side of social disapproval. And so when I look at the tattoos that I see in New York and DC, what's interesting to me is they're not the tattoos of a happy life. They're tattoos of a rugged life. Like, I saw a tattoo the other day, fall down 8 times, get up 9. They're about resilience and suffering. And I think because people in their 20s go through this tough patch. And so the sense of fear is a tough sense. And then the one thing I'll say, I've already said this once today to students, but I'm going to say it to you. The most important decision you're going to make in your life is who you marry. And so every class in college should be about the marriage decision. It should be about the science of marriage, the psychology of marriage, the neuroscience of marriage, the literature of marriage. I mean, read George Eliot, Jane Austen. They really knew what they were talking about. And I tell this to college presidents all the time. You should really be teaching courses on this. And they never listen to me. But even if you don't think you're going to get married for 10, 12 years, start thinking about it now. Because then you'll be ready when love strikes. So that's my one bit of random advice.
state national initiative called Democracy and Informed Citizen. And the partners I'm working with here in South Carolina, one of the things we're going to examine is, do opinion writers still matter? I would love to have any kind of commentary that you can help me as we're putting this program together. You can be a part of it if you'd like, because we're submitting our grant next week. But that's one thing we want to look at is, do opinion writers still matter? So any thoughts?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm glad that a grant is going to determine whether my existential existence has any meaning at all. First, I want to thank you for your service to public broadcasting. Some of you may know I do a show on PBS called the NewsHour with a guy named Mark Shields. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks. We want to call it Brooks Shields. That would be better. About Mark is the sweetest guy. Yeah, we've been doing this, I don't know, 14, 17 years. We've never had a fight. He's just a wonderful human being. My joke about him is our segment is now called Shields and Brooks. Before that it was Shields and Chigo. Before that it was Shields and Gergen. And then before that it was Shields and Coolidge. And then it was Shields and Aquinas, I think is how it started. And now, do opinion writers still matter? It depends on what you, obviously I think yes, because I do this. But if you think that the job of an opinion writer is to change minds, no, we don't do that. It's not like I was saying this earlier, it's not like I'm going to write a column and the president's going to call me and say, I was really, my immigration bill was saying A, but then I read your brilliant column and I realized it was wrong and I should do this. That's not going to happen. But we can do two things, and I think we do two things, and I think for some reason the internet looks a person, and the page views are way up. The opinion really dominates on page views. And I think we don't tell people what to think, but we poke them into thinking. We try to provide a context in which they could think. And then the second thing we do is my colleague Tom Friedman has the phrase, you name it, you own it. Everybody's busy, but we don't have anything to do. So we can look at all the data in the world and we can try to say, okay, here's what I think is going on. And I tried to do that tonight with these three eras. And so Tom, about 5 years ago, he came into my office and he said, I've got a title for my next book. And I said, what is it? And he said, I'm going to call it The World is Flat. And I remember thinking, what a bad title. Everybody sort of knows that. But he was naming something about globalization that a lot of people sort of knew, but they wanted to really know more about. And so Tom is really good at naming things. And so I do think we have tremendous value in just helping provoke, and then just saying, here's what I think is going on, but not so much in converting. I don't think we do that particularly.
David, I'm going to ask you two questions. You can answer both or one or neither. But first of all, thanks for all this. Really enlightening people like me in a big way. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina. Came from a long line of patriots and racists, quite frankly. And there's still a lot of that exists kind of all over the country. But particularly in my little pocket where I came from. And I'm curious, you come across people with different beliefs all the time. How best do you engage them, whether it be political or otherwise? Because I know you're doing that a lot. And the second question is more around higher education. It's inflating at an astronomical rate, and we're getting ready to have a baby. And I'm trying to figure out how do we save for a place like Wofford or places that now might cost $40,000, $50,000 a year. Curious what advice you might give to an infant today or a young family trying to figure out what advice you give a kid as they think about that college choice going forward. Because it's becoming for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, first on that second one, because it was such a good question, come down after, talk today if it'll proceed. I've now, of course, forgotten what the first question is. Could you remind me in one word?
How do you engage?
Oh, yeah. Most people, it's so funny to be a journalist. The hardest part when I first started doing this in Chicago was asking complete strangers questions. It's just not a natural thing to do, walk up to strangers, and often it's one of the worst moments in their life. They've just had a relative murdered or something back when I was covering crime. but I've found it rarely goes wrong. People like to be listened to, and often a lot of people don't feel listened to. And so, one of the best, I've been really thinking about this today, one of the best times I ever had covering politics was in 2000, covering the Republican primary in South Carolina. If you remember, it was George Bush and John McCain. It was a big, dramatic event. And we just drive around the state for weeks. And my tactic when I'm covering political campaigns is to go to each rally 2 hours early, because the speech is uninteresting. I've heard it a million times. I could recite the speech. But talking to the people beforehand is always interesting. You always learn things. And what you find is people are the most unlikely combination of things. People don't fit into neat categories. I was at a rally actually outside of Charleston. This was this last primary. And I think I ran across a super right-wing Rand Paul, lesbian, biker, some flower arranger, something like you do, like all these things that shouldn't go together. But people are complex, and sometimes these things go together. And so I do think, I think it's generally a good rule in life to assume positive motive. And I was telling some of the students, the journalists, earlier today about, I had 2 really great interviews in my life, one of which I did nothing to earn it. Well, the first, I was a movie critic, and I interviewed Jackie Gleason. And I went down to Florida, hotel room. His wife walked in, pushed a cassette recorder, and it played Tonight Show music. Da-da-da-da-da. And then the door opens, and Jackie Gleason walks in like this. And it's just me sitting in a chair. And so for like an hour and a half, he just told me stories. And I should go back and read what I wrote about it. The one story I remember now is when he was doing Honeymooners, he was drinking with Joe DiMaggio at a bar called Tooth Shores in New York, and he bet DiMaggio $1,000 that he could run him around the block and beat him. DiMaggio is an athlete, Jackie Gleason's 300 pounds, seemed like a good bet for DiMaggio. So they go outside the bar and they start running, and as DiMaggio's turning the corner, he sees Gleason huffing and puffing up to the front door. He said, "I can't believe it." And Gleason said, "I'm fat, I'm not going to be able to do this twice, let's go double or nothing." And so they run around, and once again, DiMaggio turns the corner, and he sees Gleason huffing and puffing up to the front door. And so he owes him $2,000. They go back into the bar, and 45 minutes later, DiMaggio says, "We ran up around the block. We never crossed on the bottom side." And Gleason had hired a car to drive him most of the way. So that was a good interview. That was easy. But the one that I was telling the students about was, I was covering the decline of the Soviet Union in 93 or so. And if you remember, Boris Yeltsin took over and the communists tried a coup. And they rolled all these tanks into Moscow, and they rolled up to the Russian parliament building, and Yeltsin got on one of the tanks on his side and gave a speech sort of shouting down the communist soldiers. And I was in the crowd, and there was a woman who was 93 who, when she was a kid, she grew up in the Tsar's household, and she knew the last Tsar in the family. Then she married a guy who was killed in the civil wars that happened in 1917, just after the revolution. Then she married another guy. They had kids, 3 of whom were killed in the Battle of Stalingrad. And then her second husband was taken away one day and sent off to Siberia, and she never heard from him again. Then she was a member of the Kalmyk people, and they were banished to Siberia by Khrushchev. And so she had experienced every single piece of Soviet history in her life. And in 93, she was ending her life, or getting near the end of her life, passing out sandwiches to the democracy protesters. And so if you ask people, they always have amazing stories to tell. And there's usually some reason they believe what they believe. And a lot of people in my business, they send these really nasty emails back to me, and you think, oh, they're monsters. But then if you write back to them a kind email, thank you, and show that you're a human being and so are they immediately back down, and they become kind, normal people. And so that just assuming positive intent gets you a long way. Let's take one more question. Is there any up there?
Yeah.
You mentioned the breakdown in the trust of the institutions over the last generation, from 80 to 18, I think was the number.
Well, I think it broke down for a lot of reasons. One, it broke down, a lot of it happened during Vietnam, then Watergate, and then a whole series of crises sort of knocked away at the trust. But then I think some of what skepticism about government and institutions became cynicism. It became so easy to say, oh, they're all a bunch of crooks. The media, you guys are all liars. Higher ed, you guys are a bunch of elitists. And it's not true. But cynicism is easy because it makes you seem like you're smarter and better than everybody else. And so I think some accurate calling into account, saying, no, actually I know a lot of people in government, most are in it for the right reasons. And the government is hard, higher ed is hard, but they're in it for the right reasons. So the one thing that has to happen is we have to eliminate the social chasm between people with less education and people with more. And I think it's up to all of us to be part of some organization with people totally unlike ourselves. That can only happen on a face-to-face basis. If you're a, affluent liberal, try to make friends with a poor NRA member or vice versa. I just think that's important, what has to happen. Second, we actually have to fix the economic problem that the top 20% see their incomes go like this and the bottom 80 just don't. That's an economic problem we just somehow have to solve. And then finally, it's a really weird phenomenon that over the last 50 years, we've made our society much more fair. We're not perfect, of course, but we have more access for minorities, for women, for different ethnic groups. We've raised the talent level as we've brought more people in. But would we say our institutions are necessarily working better? Is Wall Street working better? Is government working better? It doesn't seem to have translated as much into that. And so I think the final thing I'll say is we have to recultivate an institutional mindset. And in a non-institutional mindset, you think, I'm growing out into the world, I'll create something. In an institutional mindset, you think, I'm born into a world with certain institutions, Wofford College, the NFL, the medical profession, the electrician's profession. This institution was here before I was born. It's going to be here after I die. I'm not going to try to remake myself. This institution has certain standards that I'm going to try to live up to. The standards of being a doctor will be how I will define excellence in my life. And all I'm going to try to do is take possession of this institution, be grateful for it, and try to pass it along to the next generation a little better than it used to be. And that's a very different mindset than the individualist mindset that I'm going to make my own life. I'm going to pour myself into institutions. And people were probably in this room 70 and 80 years ago, and they'll probably be in this room in 70 or 80 years. And having a wider time horizon is the beginning of humility and the beginning of service. So, thank you very much.